All right, family. I'm going to remind you the Bible begins with these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on, it says, now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. One of the things that we understand from the Bible is there is only one God. There's only one God. There's only one God, and that one God has three persons. Three persons making one and only God. Now, each of these three persons, they are all fully God, and yet there's a uniqueness to each of the three, but everything about them is God. And another thing we see clearly in the Bible is that all three persons are right here seen in the first three verses of the Bible. They're there, they're at work from the beginning. We see God the Father. In the beginning, He created the heavens and the earth. We see God the Spirit hovering over the surface of the waters. And then we see God the Son, Jesus. A little bit harder to see Jesus in these few verses, but we're helped with that. And we see in the New Testament, where the New Testament looks back and shows us Jesus here at the beginning. We look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, and we see that everything that was created by Jesus. Everything that's been made has been made through Jesus. That the Father is the creator who does his work of creation via Jesus, via his Son. The Father spoke, and then the Word made it be. God spoke, and the Word created, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And we understand, especially very clearly from the New Testament, that it was made by and for Jesus. Now, I say all of that because we are now diving into a study on the book of John. And the Gospel of John, and this is our first time opening to the Gospel of John. Last week we did an introduction message. This time we get to the first verses, and the first verses of the book of John, the first words are reflecting the very first words of the Bible. The first words of the Bible were, in the beginning, God created. The first words of John read like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And all things were created through Him, the Word. And apart from Him, the Word, not one thing was created that has been created. That's how we start in the words here of the Gospel of John. I'm hoping you're excited about this year ahead, as we're going to look at a study all about Jesus. Now, every study, every book of the Bible is all about Jesus. That's kind of what we do here. We talk about Jesus. But this year, it's going to be a little bit more special, a little bit more focused in the fact that we are just looking at the person, the life, the work, the miracles, the wonder, the gospel of Jesus, who He is, and what He's done by going through John's account of the life of Jesus. Last week we talked about how it's different than the other Gospels, and how the other Gospels have many stories about what Jesus has done and what Jesus has said, where John only has a few, but he chooses these few, maybe 8 in all, to make a very clear, bold statement for a very specific reason. The reason why John writes this book is so that you who did not walk on the shores of Galilee with Jesus of Nazareth himself, you who haven't done that, he writes it so you will believe. So that you'll believe, and that by believing, you will have life in His name. That's straight from John chapter 20. That's why he wrote the book, so that you would believe. Believe what? Believe that Jesus is who we are going to be talking about through this study. Believe that Jesus is our Savior, that Jesus is the Son of God, the only hope for the world. John starts a little bit differently. He doesn't start with the little baby Jesus story. He doesn't start with that. He doesn't start with the genealogy. Hey, here's where Jesus comes from. When John wants to start with the beginnings of the Jesus story, he starts from the beginning and he makes it clear that he was already existing in the beginning. And so we see that this idea of Jesus, and now it does say he was born. It talks about this idea of how the Word became flesh, and we're going to see that in verse 14, and that's part of the story. But for John, if you really want to know about Jesus, if you want to have an idea of who this Jesus is and what he's like, the first thing you need to know about Jesus and his background is Jesus made you. In the beginning was Jesus. And you were made by him. You're made by him. In fact, everything was made by him. In the prayer time this morning, I was praying over our gathering, and one of the things that kept coming through my mind is this verse, the verse in the New Testament that talks about how everything was made by him and for him. And I was thinking about how this gathering exists for Jesus. We're here today for Jesus. We're here today to worship Jesus. We're here, the seats are here for Jesus. The seats, the whole room exists for Jesus. Everything is made by Jesus, and God, Jesus, made you. That's what John first wants you to know. Now we're just gonna charge through these first 18 verses. John spends these first 18 verses in this amazing introduction. It's vague and clear at the same time. It's succinct and bold at the same time. And you know, if we were going to try and pull every verse and enjoy it in its goodness, we would be spending weeks on these 18 verses. But what's clear about these first 18 verses, and we're going to go fast today, but these first 18 verses are John's basic statement about what he's going to be talking about the whole time in the rest of the book. These 18 verses are going to summarize everything that he's talking about. And then for the rest of our study, we're going to see examples. Oh, this is what Jesus means by, this is what John meant by the fact that there's life in Jesus, that we can be born again, that there's light in Jesus. And so all the stories are going to be, that we're going to be looking at are going to expand, explain, prove that Jesus was exactly who John is declaring him to be right from the beginning here. One of the things I love about this prologue for us here today is that there's 4 simple questions that John wants to address before we start diving into the story of Jesus. Before we get going, he just wants to give you a quick introduction, and the first thing he wants you to know is, who is Jesus? He wants you to know, at least just a really quick version, who is Jesus, who we're about to study. He wants you to know how Jesus is different than other religious leaders, all here at the beginning. He wants you to know why you should personally pay attention to the story of Jesus, why you need to take Jesus seriously and look closely at him. And then fourthly, in the introduction, he's going to be dealing with what did Jesus want us to know? What did he want us to know about God? Now, obviously, those are big questions, and he's only going to spend a brief amount of time on them. But I just want to encourage you, it's okay, because we're going to spend the whole rest of the study diving deeper and deeper in these questions. Who is Jesus? What did he want us to know about God? How is he different than other religious leaders? Why should I personally pay close attention to him? Now, I've spent a lot of time, some of you know I was a Greek major, majored in biblical languages, partially because I like the Bible, and so it gave me more time in the Bible. And I've translated this passage so many times, and we could talk about, some of you are here and you're hoping I'll talk about like the Greek word for word, logos, or life, zoe, or flesh, sark, and you're hoping that I'm going to dive into the, I'm not really going to go there today. I think this passage is glorious in its depth, but also it's glorious in its simplicity. And one of the things I love about the gospel is it has its depth and it has such wonderful simplicity. And we're going to delight in that this morning as we go through this passage. Okay, so we're going to dive in. We're going to first be looking at the question, who is Jesus? And I'm going to start reading the first 5 verses of the Gospel of John. The words are going to be on the screen. If you want to have your Bibles open, that's fine. But the words are going to be on the screen. The Gospel of John begins here, and I started reading it, but we're going to go back and read it all the way. It says this. It says, in the beginning, John writes, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him. And apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. Life was in him. And that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. Who is Jesus? The first thing that John wants to start explaining is this idea of who is Jesus, and the first answer is Jesus is God. He's fully God, but unique. He's fully God, but unique. There's no way, first of all, I just need to say, there's no way you can talk about the Trinity without at least touching on heresy. I mean, it's just so complicated. So we're just, grace, Brian, we're just going to just flood you with grace right now. We get it, okay? Jesus is God. He's fully God, but he's unique. And with these first words of the book, you see this idea of he was with God and he was God. He was God, but there's also some unique aspect there. He was with God and he was God. Now, I'm not going to go too deep here, but it's the uniqueness of Jesus here in his godness. It's the uniqueness that John mostly wants to highlight here. John doesn't say Jesus was with God. He doesn't just say Jesus was God. He goes back and forth. He says Jesus was with God. Jesus was God. He was with God. Just so we're clear, he was with, he was with. All right. He doesn't just say one thing. He's saying he was God, but there's something about him that's unique. Now, spoiler alert, in verse 14, we're going to find out that part of that uniqueness, and the main part of this uniqueness is that he became flesh, that he became a person. We're going to discover the impossible, that Jesus became a person, that God became a human being. At least this aspect of the Trinity, this part of God. And I say that because John wants some clarity from the very beginning that not all that is God became flesh, but all that is God became flesh. Does that make sense to you? That God in Jesus became flesh, that Jesus is God unique. He's unique because he's the only one of the Trinity to become human. The Holy Spirit did not become human. The Father did not become human. Jesus, fully God. But his uniqueness was he became human, and that's incredibly centrally important to the whole book and to understanding who Jesus is, that uniqueness right there. So Jesus is unique. He's 100% God, but he's unique in the fact that he became human. And now I'm gonna jump ahead just so that we can stay in some sort of logical unfolding order of these notes here. As I mentioned down in verse 14, the Word became flesh. Who is Jesus? He's God, 100% fully God, but unique. And also he's human. Fully human. Jesus is fully human, but unique. There is no other human being. There never has been, there never will be another human being like Jesus. He was fully human, but no other human being created you. No other human being was God in the beginning. Jesus is entirely unique. Now, as a mental side note, okay, so you're thinking about John writing this book, right? And he's been reflecting on this for a long time because we're about 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, about 70 years or so, 60 years after the cross. So there's John reflecting. He's like, yeah, you know what? I used to walk and talk and banter and get rebuked by and eat fish on the shore of Galilee with my Creator. I mean, what a thought as John is talking about not just this God, but this human who he knew, who he walked with, who he talked with, he knew, and who he knew loved him. I suppose you can say the most accurate line about Jesus is this: there's no one like him. There's no one like him. He's unique. There's no one like him. What else do we learn about God? Well, we learn that he's the creator. We learn that Jesus is the creator, which we've talked about. We've learned about him that he is life. We saw that in this verse. Life was in it. He's the life bringer, the bringer of life. Jesus carries life. You want life? You want new life? You want abundant life? You want life to the full? Where do you go for that? Well, there's one place. You go to Jesus for that. If you look at your current life and you're like, I need life. I need more life. I'm lacking here. Well, Jesus is the bringer of life. New life to people who desperately need it. And that life is light. The fifth thing is light. Jesus is the bringer of light. Now, these are huge concepts. These are huge concepts about Jesus. Jesus as life, as the bringer of life. Jesus as light, the light of the world, the overcomer of darkness. And the temptation would be to sit here and talk about what Jesus is as life and as light. But don't worry, we're going to spend so much time in our study thinking about Jesus as the light of the world, as life. We're going to see all through the Gospel of John. But if you want a John cheat sheet on light, when it is about Jesus being light and life, just quickly go through 1 John. You're going to find those words all through the book of 1 John, and John, same author, is writing all about what he means by Jesus as light and Jesus as life. We'll talk more about that in the days ahead. But for now, we're just being introduced to some things by John that we're going to tuck away, that he's just going to unfold for us in the days ahead as we go through this gospel. So that's what John wants us to know at the beginning. You want to know who Jesus is? Well, he's God, he's human, he is the creator, he's light, he's life. And then he goes on to his next question in the next part of the prologue here. And it says this in verse 6. It says, there was a man named John, different John, right? This is John the Baptist, not John the author. Confusing, yes, but we're going to run with it. There was a man named John who was sent from God. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. John was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. Again, so this is John the Baptist. Now, if you were going to rate in your brain the great religious leaders of the Bible, you'd probably start with, well, I hope you'd start with Jesus, but okay, you'd probably start with Moses. Maybe you'd say Abraham, maybe you'd say David, maybe you'd say, I don't know, some of those guys. Maybe you'd probably say Moses would be one of your top ones. But when the author here chooses a great religious leader to start and proclaim that he's talking about Jesus, he could have said Moses easily. He could have said Abraham easily. But he chooses John the Baptist. And now our generation might, I think we greatly underestimate the worldwide impact of John the Baptist in the first century. He's mentioned a little bit in the Bible, but I think we greatly underestimate his worldwide impact because the Bible doesn't say all that much about him. But what it does say is, it does say that decades after John the Baptist's death, he still has followers and disciples in far-off cities like Ephesus. Paul meets them there when he goes there. And you see, Jesus says about John, he says, of all those born of women, John was the greatest. That's pretty high praise, right? Jesus says, you're the greatest. I mean, you take that, right? You take that. Now, I don't want to say anything else about John because next week is all about John the Baptist. We're going to go straight from the prologue right into John's testimony about Jesus. But my quick thought is we might underestimate John the Baptist, his life and his ministry. And so the second question, though, that is being introduced, which we're going to dive into more next week, is the question, how is Jesus different than other great religious leaders? And this is the case study of John the Baptist here. But the main difference is this. All the other ones, Abraham, Moses, everyone else, John the Baptist, they are pointers. Jesus is the one being pointed to. The other religious leaders are pointing to Jesus and saying, this one is coming. And John's saying, this is the one we've been waiting for. Jesus is not pointing at anybody, they're all pointing to him. That's the difference, and we're going to talk about that more next week. Let's keep reading in our prologue here. Verse 10, the light, Jesus, which we haven't heard his name yet, he was in the world, and the world was created through him, yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, which means his creation. And his own people, which means the genetic descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those who had received the scriptures, those who had had the prophets. So he came to his own creation, and his own people meaning the Jewish people, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. The third question that John wants to deal with at the beginning here is, why should I personally pay close attention to Jesus? Why should I personally pay close attention to Jesus? And this is right at the heart of one of the most repeated messages all through the whole book of John. And the message is this: Jesus was mostly rejected. We're going to see it over and over again. Jesus was mostly rejected. Jesus, who is God, Jesus, who created, Jesus, who is unique, Jesus, who is human, Jesus, who is life and light, rejected. He was rejected by most people. And that's just the horror of the story as you're going through the gospel. That's the tragedy of what's taking place as we go through. So many people are rejecting him, but the thing is, not everyone rejects him. Most do. But some didn't reject him. And some actually believed. And what does it mean to believe in Jesus? Well, it doesn't just mean to believe that he existed. Everybody in Jesus' day believed he existed. They saw him. It wasn't just to mean that he was a righteous and good person. They saw that. It doesn't just, to believe in Jesus doesn't mean just they thought he did that he was special and unique. I mean, the crowds were flocking to him for healing and to see miracles. What it means to believe in Jesus is to believe that Jesus was actually who he was. To believe that he was God. To believe that he was human. And to believe that by receiving him, says verse 12, but to all who did receive him, receiving him, you get something new. You get to be born of God. Born of God. You get to become a child of God. And maybe you're thinking, if you've read the Gospel of John before, well, that's exactly like chapter 3 with Nicodemus, and Jesus is going to spend a lot of time explaining that. We're going to see that in the future. But just by way of introduction, why should I personally pay close attention to Jesus? Answer, because we all have a choice to make. Reject him or receive him. That's why we need to pay attention to this whole story. Reject him like so many, or believe. Reject him or become a child of God, born again of God. Now, I told you last week that this is why John wrote the book. He wrote the book so that you would believe. And that by believing, you would have life. That you would have life in Jesus' name. The story of Jesus isn't just the story of Jesus, of God becoming flesh. It's a story that requires a response and evaluation. It's a pay close attention story, because so much of all of your life and now and in the future and in eternity hinges on how you deal with this Jesus person. If you ignore him, that's a choice. You can do that. I don't recommend it. That's a tragedy that so many go through. How you respond to Jesus means everything. And we're going to see over and over again an example of people making a choice. Am I going to reject him, or am I going to respond? And am I going to receive him? The last section here in the prologue says this. It says, the word Jesus became flesh. One of the most shocking 4 words. One of the most impossible 4 words. The word became flesh and took up residence among us, tabernacled among us, dwelt among us. We observed, key word there, we observed his glory, the glory of as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And then a quick side note here, John testified concerning him and exclaimed, "This is the one of whom I said, the one coming after me has surpassed me because he existed before me." Indeed, we have all received grace after grace from his fullness. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Oh, that's the first time we find out this guy's name. I mean, you probably knew it before. Okay, but here in the book of John, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the one and only Son, the one who is at the Father's side, has revealed him. Has revealed him. See, the thing about Jesus is the way that we get to observe what our unobservable God is like. See, in every generation, there's always been the question, what is God really like? Every generation. Is there a God? Is he knowable? Is he angry? Does he hate me? Is there any hope that he would like me? Everybody, there's a mystery about what is God really like. Is he distant from me? Or is he close? Does he do anything today? Every generation wants to know and has been asking, what is God really like? Well, Jesus came so that you could see what God is like. So you could see it in Jesus. What does Jesus do? Well, that's what God is like. He came so that we could observe God and what he is like. What is he like? Well, what is God like? The fourth question that John wants to deal is, what did Jesus want us to know? And the answer is that God is incredibly grace-giving. That God is incredibly grace-giving. I mean, in these verses, you see, like, we observed his glory, full of grace and truth, verse 14. In verse 16, we have all received grace after grace from his fullness. Verse 17, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. You see this idea of what is God like? Well, he is the extender through Jesus of grace upon grace upon grace. Now, family, this is just the beginning of our study. This is John's quick introduction here. This is his first words, and basically, it's just an overview of what he's going to be talking about for the rest of the book, an overview of what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the year. We're about to study Jesus. And this is what we're going to take into our study with us. Jesus, what do we know about him so far? There is no one like him. Jesus is the one that brings life. He brings life to you. Jesus is the one who brings light to your darkness. Jesus is the one who loves you, and Jesus is the one who made you. Jesus is the one that tells you and makes it so obvious that for you, there is grace upon grace after grace upon grace after grace available to you from God. And we'll talk about this more in the days ahead, but just for now, some of you need grace. And you know in your heart right now, you need grace. Some of you need life, new life. And you know it. You've heard me talking. You know it. Some of you need light. Like, there's a lot of darkness here, and you need light to invade this darkness and bring change. You know that. And the good news is, all of that is available because of Jesus. That's the point of this whole story. Now, how do you get that? How do you get that life? How do you get that light? How do you get that grace? Well, you get grace not by ignoring Jesus, not by rejecting Jesus, but you get that by choosing to receive Jesus. And that might mean different things for different ones of you in this room, depending on what your current standing with Jesus is. For some of you, that means becoming a Christian. That means you've never received Jesus into your life. You've never said, Jesus, I believe you are who the Bible says you are. I believe that you are God. I believe that you are human, that you died on the cross for my sins. I believe that you give grace and forgiveness. I believe that you fill us with light and life, and that in you I am born again. And if you've not done that, well then today you find yourself at another moment of choice. How are you going to respond to Jesus? Receive or reject? I'm going to give you a chance to make that decision in a moment. But others of you have been Christians for a while. And you've been Christians, and maybe you look at your heart right now, and you're like, you know what? If I'm truthful to myself, there's darkness here. And I need light back again inside. That I need life back here again. I've been off track for a while, and I need grace. I need grace again. I need a new beginning. And you've been a Christian, but you know, I need to get back on track, and I need to stop in my way pushing Jesus away in those little rejection ways, and I need to start pulling him back, receiving him, and receiving that light, and again calling on God to fill my life with light and life. It's time for you to make a choice as well in how you live and how you pray and how you act, to maybe stop pushing Jesus away from your heart and by bringing him in. We're going to give you that choice, that moment to pray in a moment. But while you're thinking about what you need to do, based on what's going on in your heart, for the whole church, I'm going to give a few challenges, and then we'll come back to this. Challenge number one, this is a study on life and light. So challenge number one, and I want you to just pick one of these challenges, not all three challenges this week, unless you're okay. Challenge, I want you to do a quick study of the word life in the book of John, using all the verses, or write a short paragraph summarizing all that John's mean when he says Jesus is life. And maybe for you, if you're like, I need life, this would be a great study for you. How do you do that? You go to Bible Gateway, you type in the word life, you go down the right-hand column, which for you, this is the right-hand column, and you click on the book of John, and it's going to show you every verse that John uses the word life in. You just read them all and say, oh, this is what John is saying when it comes to his use of life. If you feel darkness on the inside and you understand that you need light on the inside, then do the same study, which is number 2 here, with the word light. Just light, John. The third one is, and this is fun, have a quick read through the book of 1 John and be surprised by all that John says about Jesus being light and life. It's everywhere. It's just 5 short chapters. You can look at